One of, if not the best stories in the 2024 NFL Draft is the insane rise of Ray Davis. He was a running back for Temple, Vanderbilt, and most recently Kentucky, and was taken by the Buffalo Bills and will be immediately made their backup running back to James Cook. Davis has an unbelievable story. He was homeless for most of his childhood, bounced around from family to family, went to high schools across the country, and was only really rated as a 3-star player with pretty much no hope. He somehow went from a guy who was homeless to not only with a degree from a school like Vanderbilt, but also now a chance to compete in the NFL. He's one of the most insane and inspiring stories, and in today's video, we're to talk about Ray Davis. We're to go through his homeless journey as a child, how he got recruited, how he made it work at 3 different college programs, and why he could be the next big thing in the NFL for the Bills. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I could cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the impossible rise of Ray Davis. In order to understand how Davis got to this point, we need to go back in time. When he was drafted just a couple of weeks ago, everybody wanted Ray Davis. 11 years earlier though, no one did. Picture this, at 9 years old, he was walking the streets of San Francisco each and every morning as he would drop his younger sister off at school and then would come back home to take care of his little brother. His chair in his 3rd grade classroom was always empty, sometimes for days and sometimes for even weeks. After that, he'd run out of places to stay and people to ask. At one point, he lived with his mom, but she would go away. He would stay with his grandma and sleep on her floor, and then sometimes social workers would check in on him and they would lie, saying that he had a bedroom of his own. He would do anything to stay out of the foster care system, and by the time he was 8, he was part of the state. By the time he was 12, he was living in a homeless shelter with 2 of his 14 siblings, and when he learned that a foster family could take 2 but not all 3 kids, he volunteered to stay back so his brother and sister would not have to go into the system. He said, quote, "If they can get out and be together, that's the best thing for them." Picture him sitting on a social worker's car, texting and calling pretty much everyone he can think of, begging for a couch or a chair to sit on, only to be told sorry or no too many times to count. Now that he's in middle school, he basically begs his teacher to stay for a night or 2. Eventually, the family would let him stay, and he would be in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in the heart of San Francisco with pretty much no future. He was probably never going to go to college, he would have just been another statistic. But now you need to look at him. He's 24 years old, was just drafted into the NFL, had a decorated career at 3 different big-time programs, and has a degree from Vanderbilt. Ray Davis is absolutely insane. Davis said, quote, "You never hear the success stories, you always hear the failure ones. My goal is to be successful, and I want to be an advocate for kids in the system, and foster kids because I was like them." So how did all this happen for Ray Davis? Well, let's go back in time a little bit more. His real name is Raymond Davis, and he grew up in the Hayes Valley area of San Francisco. Things were rough on him as a kid, and there was one thing that he always looked forward to. It was sports. When he was an orphan staying at a hospital, he only had 1 hour where he could leave a day, and he would spend that time shooting hoops. As I said, sports were big to him, especially football, as his dad was a legend. He would hear stories about his father, as he had actually broken O.J. Simpson's record for touchdowns in a year, and he was named the San Francisco Player of the Year in 1998. But sadly, his dad was in prison at the time. While things were really difficult for him, football made things a little bit easier. Davis said, quote, "The one thing that got me out was football. It sounds cliche, but it's real. Anybody who knew me from age 12 on could tell that football was always something I looked forward to. I could never think about all the negatives in life. I could always just think about getting back on the football field because that's where everybody loved me." From age 9 to 14, Davis would play for a local Pop Warner team and would routinely go for 80-yard touchdowns. Sadly though, being in the system and being homeless would really take a toll on his seasons. He said, quote, "When football was taken away, I had some really rough times, because when football was taken away, the people were gone. Davis was always good, but he never had the money to sign up, so coaches would always cover the cost. They'd give him rides to and from games, and they'd even take him out to eat. Eventually, he would get some stability, as after a basketball tournament, he would ask his friend Bradley if he could get a ride home. Eventually, Bradley's mom, named Laura Banks, told him that if he got in the car, she was going to ask him 100 questions. Ray thought it was a joke, but she ended up asking about 300 questions. He said that she learned about his life in the course of 6 hours. She said, quote, "I didn't know where he lived or who his parents were, but I didn't know him from elementary school. I knew he was on the team, and he wasn't, and then he was again. There were tons of rumors flying around, but he didn't have the access to education like my kids, and I wanted to know what I could do." Ray said he still looks up to Laura Banks and her husband, as he said, quote, "That's like my mom, and she raised me from age 15 on. I'm a part of that family." It was also at that same time that Davis would blossom into one of the city's premier high school running backs, and eventually he could make it if he could just get an opportunity. Laura Banks found out about a boarding school in New York, and eventually he called them and set up an appointment. Originally he interviewed with the basketball coach at Trinity Pawling, but he also said he could play football, and he was given a full scholarship. Except the problem was, since he was only 16, he could not legally go over there alone. He couldn't leave the state of California unless he could somehow be taken in. Luckily at the time, his dad had just gotten out of jail and started to get his life back together and would eventually try to get custody of his son. They ended up having to go to court to get it all resolved, and despite a ton of pushback from local people and attorneys, Davis was granted his chance and could now move across the country to pursue college and football. He said, quote, "The school was an athletic boarding school and a low-tier IMG academy. I played basketball, football, and baseball, and I even ran track. However, football was Ray Davis's ticket out. He rushed for 500 yards and 5 touchdowns, got his grades up, and then started getting recruiting letters from schools such as Syracuse and Boston College. Despite not being able to make it work, he would need a prep year to improve his academic standing and would eventually enroll at Blair Academy in New Jersey, where he would rush for 1,700 yards and 35 touchdowns in just 8 games. Pretty soon, college coaches from around the country came calling, and his first scholarship offer came from Purdue. When it did, Ray sat down with his father, and they cried. This was a huge moment, and eventually he would choose Temple over offers from Kent State, Albany, Maine, Navy, Purdue, and Towson. In total, Davis was tremendous as he played in 33 games, rushing for nearly 5,000 yards and 59 touchdowns. He also had 80 tackles and 6 picks on defense, and according to 24/7 Sports, he was a 3-star recruit, the number 116 running back, and the 1,812th best player in the class of 2019. So after overcoming impossible odds, how would Raymond Davis do at Temple? When Davis arrived at Temple in 2019, the Owls had become a pretty decent college football program. Guys like Steve Adazio, Matt Rule, and Al Golden had just coached there, and they were recently coming off the Jeff Collins era as well. Davis would burst onto the scene right away, as he would run for 936 yards and 8 touchdowns as a true freshman. He was named a freshman All-American, and his yards ranked 7th in the conference and 5th amongst FBS freshmen. As a sophomore in 2020, Davis would eventually run for 300 yards and 1 touchdown, but would then opt out for the remainder of the year. He also decided he's going to be entering the transfer portal, and apparently he was also suspended, but I can't really find out a ton of information about that. After 2 solid years at Temple, he would decide to enter the transfer portal. He wanted to find a bigger stage, and eventually decided to go over to Vanderbilt. Coach Clark Lee would happily take him in, and in Davis's first year with the Commodores, he ran for 211 yards and 1 touchdown. By no means was he a star, but 2022, he would prove to the world that he could be a big-time player in a conference like the SEC. Davis would burst onto the scene right away, as against Hawaii, he had 87 yards and a touchdown, and had nearly 100 yards in each of his next few games against Elon and Wake Forest. He'd go over the 100-yard mark against Northern Illinois, and then would continue on for the rest of the year. He had over 100 yards and a touchdown against Ole Miss, had 167 yards in a loss to South Carolina, had 129 yards and a touchdown and a huge upset victory over number 24 Kentucky, and then had 122 yards in a win over Florida. Vanderbilt got a couple of sneaky cool wins, and at this point they were now 5-7. They'd have to beat a really good Tennessee team if they wanted to make a bowl game, and they would get shut out 56-0. In total, Davis would finish with 1,042 yards with 5 touchdowns. He also had 3 scores in the receiving department. And now, after 2 good years at Vanderbilt, plus a degree, he would have to decide between going pro and going to the portal. He knew he was a fringe NFL prospect at best, so he decided to bolster his credentials and find one more school. One thing he wanted to do was to go into a system that produced NFL running backs and get a chance to win some games. The Commodores went 7-17 during his time at Vandy, and he said, quote, "I just knew if I wanted to compete with the best and test my skills as a player, staying in the SEC was a no-brainer. A majority of my offers came from the SEC, which was great because it showed my hard work paid off." Davis said he talked to 11 schools on his first day in the portal, but with Chris Rodriguez getting drafted to the Commanders, Kentucky was in need for a workhorse running back. He decided to commit to the Big Blue Nation, and right away, Davis took off. He went for over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against Ball State, had a touchdown in Week 3 against Akron, and then had 2 touchdowns in a game against Vanderbilt. Kentucky was now off to a 4-0 start, and then he would burst onto the scene. Against number 22 Florida, Davis ran for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns. This was his breakout performance, and at this point, he was getting some low-key Heisman hype. It probably wasn't going to happen, though. Kentucky would get humbled the next week against Georgia, and then they would also lose to Missouri. He would end up having 128 yards in that game, and then would also score a touchdown against Tennessee, but they would lose that one. From there, Davis kind of cooled off for the remainder of the year in terms of yardage, as he never had more than 80 yards, but he did have 2 touchdowns against Bama, and a touchdown against both South Carolina and against a top 10 Louisville team. Instead of opting out of the bowl game, Davis would want to finish what he started, and against number 22 Clemson, he would carry the ball for 63 yards and a score. They'd end up losing to the Tigers, but Davis would finish with 1,100 yards and 14 touchdowns. He was also a great player out of the backfield, as he had 29 catches for 300 yards and 7 scores there. Davis was an absolute tank in his one and only year at Kentucky, and was now going to head off to the NFL. Eventually seen as a day 2 selection, he was taken in day 2. He was taken with the 128th overall pick in the 4th round by the Buffalo Bills, and he was drafted to be the backup running back to James Cook. As he arrived here, he had this to say, quote, "After what I've been through, what's going to get in my way now?" That's sort of the mindset that Ray Davis has, and currently, he's a guy that could have a big impact in the league. Not only is he going to run extremely hard, but he is pretty athletic, he can catch passes out of the backfield, and has pretty much everything you want out of an NFL running back. While he may not be the most athletic or have all the perfect traits, he has that mental fortitude that I think is going to get the job done, and he'll be great as a backup in year 1 in Buffalo. There's a lot of people who think he's a low-key sleeper for fantasy as well, and we'll really just have to wait and see. Currently, he'll also be battling out with Frank Gore Jr., and while Davis wants to make an impact in the NFL, he said he more so wants to reach out and inspire other kids like him who are in similar positions. He's much more worried about that, and in my eyes, Ray Davis is a huge winner. He went from homeless and bouncing around from school to house, and somehow found a way to get a scholarship in high school, made his prep year work, and became a good running back at 3 different colleges. He even got some Heisman hype at one point, dominated some SEC defenses, and now is in the league. He checked every box, and honestly, that's how we're going to end the video. But what do you guys think? If you're a Bills or a Kentucky fan, what do you think of Ray Davis and his impact? How do you think he'll do this year? And what other rookie should I do next? There are tons of players with great stories, so be sure to drop one down below, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen, including my rise of Keon Coleman. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.